They would remember her as Calamity Jane, a legend carved from whiskey and gunpowder. But before the stories grew wild, before her name became myth, there was simply Martha, a young woman who chose to ride toward the horizon when everyone else suggested she stay home and learn to embroider. Morning breaks across the endless American frontier of the 1870s. Sagebrush whispers in the wind. Campfire smoke drifts lazily skyward. Across these vast territories where rules are still being written, a woman named Martha Jane Canary moves with the quiet confidence of someone who refuses to apologize for taking up space in the world. She reads with her patterns like scripture, handles horses like poetry, and carries herself with the dignity of someone who has discovered that authenticity requires courage, but the rewards far outweigh the cost. This is not a tale of shootouts or saloon brawls. It's the slow work of choices made, skills earned, communities built, and respect gathered one honest interaction at a time until a woman's refusal to accept limitations becomes proof that different paths were always possible. Boas vindas ao canal Marca e Promessa de Valor. Fixo, welcome to American Sleepless Story, where forgotten moments from America's past become tonight's gentle companion. These are quiet histories told slowly, perfect for when your mind needs to wander somewhere peaceful. If you'd like more stories like this, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where are you listening from and what time is it where you are. I love knowing this community spans different places and time zones, all finding rest in the same American stories. Now, settle in, here comes the story. Picture yourself in the vast American frontier of the early 1870s, where the morning air carries whispers of sagebrush and endless possibility. Martha Jane Canary stands at the edge of what society expects from a young woman, gazing out at territories that stretch beyond any convention or limitation. The sleepless nights of uncertainty that kept others awake with worrying seemed to energize her with dreams of something different. This wasn't just another boring chapter in the typical American story of frontier life. This was the beginning of a legend born from pure authenticity. The gentle hum of prairie wind through tall grass becomes her soundtrack, drowning out the voices that tried to tell her who she should become. Instead of accepting the narrow paths traditionally carved out for women, she listened to something deeper, the quiet courage that whispers when you're truly ready to live your own story. The frontier offered something that eastern cities could never provide: space to breathe, to grow, to become whoever you had the courage to discover within yourself. Martha Jane understood this intuitively, the way some people understand music or mathematics. She recognized that out here, surrounded by endless sky and untamed land, the old rules seemed as distant and irrelevant as yesterday's newspaper. The sleepless anticipation of adventure replaced any fear of the unknown, while other young women her age were learning the delicate art of needlework and social pleasantries. Martha Jane was developing a different kind of delicacy, the subtle skill of reading the land, understanding weather patterns, and moving through the world with quiet confidence. This American landscape demanded practical skills over decorative ones, and she embraced that reality with the enthusiasm of someone finally finding their true element. Every morning brought opportunities to choose who she wanted to become that day. The simple act of deciding whether to ride east toward the settled towns or west toward the unknown territories was a daily referendum on authenticity versus expectation. She chose authenticity with the consistency of someone who had discovered their true north. The rhythmic clip-clop of her horses' hooves on dusty trails became a meditation, each mile taking her further from what others thought she should be and closer to who she actually was. These weren't just boring rides across empty landscape. They were journeys of self-discovery disguised as practical travel. The story she was writing with her choices would inspire countless others who felt trapped by society's narrow definitions of possibility. Teaching herself to ride like the wind wasn't just about transportation. It was about freedom in its purest form. The sensation of moving across open prairie at full gallop, with nothing but skill and courage keeping you connected to your horse, creates a kind of meditation that no drawing room conversation could ever match. Martha Jane approached these challenges with the curiosity of a natural scientist and the determination of someone who understood that competence equals independence. The sleepless hours she spent practicing, falling, getting back up, and trying again were investments in a future that only she could envision. Each bruise and callus was evidence of her commitment to becoming someone who could rely on her own abilities rather than hoping someone else would take care of her. The art of navigation by starlight became one of her most treasured skills, transforming every clear night into a classroom where the universe itself served as her teacher. Learning to read weather patterns in the color of clouds, the behavior of animals, the subtle changes in wind direction, these were skills that connected her to something ancient and reliable. Unlike the social rules that seemed arbitrary and changeable, the natural world operated according to principles that rewarded observation and respect. Martha Jane found peace in this consistency, the way you might find comfort in a familiar song. The American frontier demanded this kind of intimate knowledge of the natural world, and she discovered that she had an aptitude for it that surprised even her. These quiet hours of study and practice were never boring because they were building towards something meaningful, true self-reliance. Where others saw obstacles in the rough terrain, unpredictable weather, and general harshness of frontier life, Martha Jane saw opportunities to develop resilience and problem-solving skills. This wasn't naive optimism, it was the practical recognition that challenges are simply information disguised as difficulties. Every creek that needed crossing, every storm that needed waiting out, every mechanical problem that needed solving was a chance to prove to herself that she could handle whatever life offered. The sleepless nights spent planning routes or solving logistical problems became exercises in creative thinking rather than periods of worrying. Her story was becoming one of someone who approached life as an interesting puzzle rather than a series of threats. The decision to dress practically, speak directly, and move freely through spaces typically reserved for men wasn't rebellion for its own sake. It was the natural expression of someone who had discovered that authenticity requires courage, but the rewards far outweigh the temporary discomfort of disapproval. Martha Jane seemed to understand intuitively that other people's opinions of her choices were less important than her own sense of integrity and purpose. The gentle persistence with which she maintained her course, despite raised eyebrows and whispered comments, demonstrated a kind of inner strength that couldn't be taught or borrowed. This American approach to individualism, the idea that you could simply decide to live differently and then do it, was still relatively new, and she embodied it with grace. Her relationship with risk was particularly fascinating. She seemed to understand the difference between reckless endangerment and calculated challenge. The choices she made pushed boundaries without being thoughtlessly dangerous, demonstrating a kind of practical wisdom that comes from paying attention to consequences while refusing to be paralyzed by fear. Every skill she developed, from marksmanship to horse handling to weather reading, was approached with the methodical patience of someone building a foundation rather than seeking immediate thrills. The boring, repetitive practice sessions that others might have found tedious were, for her, meditative exercises in self-improvement. These quiet hours of skill development would later become the foundation of her reputation and her survival. The way she moved through the world, with confidence, but without arrogance, with strength, but without aggression, suggested someone who had found the sweet spot between self-assertion and respect for others. Martha Jane's approach to living authentically wasn't about rejecting everything society offered, but about carefully choosing which expectations served her highest good and which ones might be holding her back from becoming who she was meant to be. The sleepless consideration she gave to these choices showed the thoughtfulness behind what others might have seen as impulsive behavior. Her story was becoming proof that authenticity isn't about following your first impulse, but about making conscious choices aligned with your deepest values. The quiet confidence that began to characterize her presence suggested someone who had discovered something that many people spend their entire lives searching for, the peace that comes from living in alignment with your true nature. This wasn't the forced confidence of someone trying to prove a point, but the natural assurance of someone who had tested herself against real challenges and discovered her own capabilities. As word of her skills and character began to spread through frontier communities, she was unknowingly laying the groundwork for something even more significant. The transformation from Martha Jane Canary into the legend that would become Calamity Jane, where the line between authentic character and mythic storytelling would blur in the most fascinating ways. The transformation of Martha Jane Canary into the legendary Calamity Jane wasn't the result of careful marketing or deliberate image crafting. It was the natural consequence of living so authentically that people couldn't help but notice. In the sleepless hours of frontier nights, when stories were shared around campfires and in saloons, her name began to appear in conversations with increasing frequency. This wasn't because she was performing a role or trying to become famous, but because her genuine character shone so brightly that it became impossible to ignore. The American frontier was full of people trying to reinvent themselves, but Martha Jane was different. She wasn't becoming someone else. She was simply allowing her true self to emerge without apology. The boring predictability of social expectations had never appealed to her, and now that freedom was creating something remarkable. Her story was becoming proof that authenticity has its own magnetic power. The gentle hum of morning conversations in frontier towns began to include tales of a woman who could track game like a seasoned hunter, navigate by stars like an old-timer, and handle a horse with the easy confidence of someone born in the saddle. These stories weren't exaggerated legends yet. They were simply accurate accounts of skills that Martha Jane had developed through patient practice and genuine curiosity. The sleepless nights she'd spent learning to read weather patterns were now paying dividends in a reputation for stability that money couldn't buy. When settlers needed someone to guide them safely through unfamiliar territory, her name came up naturally in conversation. When supplies needed to be delivered to remote locations, people thought of her first. This wasn't celebrity. This was the organic development of trust and respect based on demonstrated competence. Her approach to storytelling revealed another dimension of her character that would become central to the Calamity Jane legend. Martha Jane understood intuitively that a good story wasn't just entertainment, it was a way of sharing wisdom, building community, and helping people make sense of their experiences. The tales she told around evening campfires weren't boastful exaggerations, but carefully crafted narratives that captured the essence of frontier life. She had a gift for finding the universal truth hidden in specific experiences, the way a skilled musician can find a melody that everyone recognizes even if they've never heard it before. The American tradition of tall tales and folklore was perfectly suited to her temperament and talents. These storytelling sessions never felt boring because she understood how to balance entertainment with genuine insight. Word of her character began to spread through the informal networks that connected frontier communities, the traders, soldiers, and travelers who carried news from town to town. The stories they shared weren't about dramatic adventures or heroic rescues, but about smaller moments that revealed something important about who Martha Jane was as a person. They talked about her habit of helping newcomers get oriented without making them feel helpless. They mentioned her ability to diffuse tense situations with humor rather than confrontation. They noted her tendency to remember people's names and ask about their families. These sleepless conversations between travelers gradually built a reputation that was based on character rather than spectacle. The friendship that developed between Martha Jane and Wild Bill Hickok became one of the most talked about relationships on the frontier, though probably not for the reasons that later romanticized versions would suggest. Their connection was based on mutual respect between two people who had each figured out how to be completely themselves in a world that often rewarded conformity. They shared the easy camaraderie of competent professionals who didn't need to prove anything to each other. The story of their friendship became part of frontier folklore because it represented something that people valued: authentic connection between strong individuals. The boring details of their actual relationship The conversations about weather and trail conditions, the shared meals and quiet companionship were less dramatic than the legends that would grow up around them, but probably more meaningful. Martha Jane's reputation for reliability during difficult times began to distinguish her from the many other colorful characters populating frontier towns. When epidemics or natural disasters struck communities, she had a habit of appearing wherever help was needed most. This wasn't calculated heroism. It was the natural expression of someone who understood that individual survival was connected to community well-being. The sleepless nights she spent caring for sick strangers weren't motivated by a desire for recognition, but by a practical understanding that in frontier communities, everyone's welfare was interconnected. Her willingness to take on unglamorous but necessary tasks earned her a different kind of respect than flashier personalities received. These American communities were learning to value substance over style. The way she moved between different social groups, soldiers, miners, business owners, Native Americans, fellow scouts, demonstrated an emotional intelligence that was becoming increasingly rare as frontier society became more stratified. Martha Jane seemed to possess an intuitive understanding that people's surface differences were less important than their common humanity. She could find common ground with almost anyone because she approached new relationships with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. The stories that emerged from these interactions were dramatic confrontations or romantic entanglements, but quiet examples of bridge building and mutual understanding. Her reputation was growing not because she was seeking attention, but because she was consistently demonstrating values that frontier communities needed. The practical skills that had started as personal survival techniques were now becoming the foundation of a professional reputation that would support her for years to come. Her ability to guide travelers safely through difficult terrain, her knowledge of water sources and weather patterns, her skill with horses and equipment, these weren't party tricks or attention-seeking behaviors, but genuine competencies that had real value in frontier economy. The sleepless hours of practice and study that had seemed like simple personal improvement were now revealing themselves as investments in the future that offered independence and respect. The boring repetition of skill development was paying dividends in a way that more dramatic pursuits never could have. As her reputation grew, Martha Jane began to understand something that would become central to her later legend, the power of narrative to shape reality. The stories people told about her were becoming more important than the specific facts of any individual incident. She discovered that she could influence these stories without lying or exaggerating, simply by understanding what people valued and making sure those values were visible in her actions. This wasn't manipulation. It was a sophisticated understanding of how reputation works in small communities. The American frontier was creating its own mythology, and she was learning to participate in that process with both integrity and intelligence. The foundation was being laid for something larger than personal success. Martha Jane was unknowingly becoming a proof of concept for a different way of being a woman in America. Her example was showing others that competence mattered more than convention, that authenticity could coexist with community acceptance, and that individual strength could serve collective good. The sleepless conversations in which people debated her choices and wondered about her motivations were actually conversations about possibility itself. As her story continued to evolve, the line between Martha Jane the person and Calamity Jane the legend would begin to blur in ways that would challenge everyone's understanding of identity, reputation, and the mysterious alchemy that transforms real people into enduring symbols. The quiet dawn hours in frontier towns revealed something beautiful about Martha Jane's character that the dramatic stories often overlooked, her natural gift for creating the kind of connections that hold communities together during difficult times. Long before the sun painted the wooden storefronts with golden light, you could find her moving through the sleepless rhythm of early morning tasks, checking on neighbors who might need assistance, sharing coffee with folks who had nowhere else to go. This wasn't the behavior of someone trying to build a reputation or prove how tough she could be. This was the natural expression of someone who understood that true strength comes from lifting others up. The American frontier could be brutally isolating, but Martha Jane seemed to possess an intuitive understanding that loneliness was optional if you were willing to invest in genuine relationships. Her story was becoming one of someone who found meaning not in individual achievement, but in the boring, daily work of building community. When smallpox and other epidemics swept through frontier settlements, Martha Jane had a habit of appearing wherever the need was greatest, not because she was seeking recognition, but because she couldn't bear the thought of people suffering alone. The sleepless nights she spent in makeshift infirmaries, cooling fevered brows and offering quiet comfort to frightened families, revealed a tenderness that existed alongside her more famous toughness. She approached caregiving with the same methodical competence she brought to tracking and riding, understanding that consistency and presence were often more valuable than dramatic gestures. These long, quiet vigils weren't exciting or adventurous, they were simply the work that needed doing, performed by someone who understood that community survival depended on individual acts of compassion. The gentle hum of her voice reading to sick children or talking softly with worried parents became a sound that people associated with hope and healing. Her ability to help newcomers find their footing in unfamiliar territory extended far beyond practical guidance about supplies and routes. Martha Jane possessed the rare gift of making people feel seen and valued without making them feel helpless or incompetent. When families arrived with nothing but determination and a few belongings, she had a way of connecting them with others who had faced similar challenges, creating networks of mutual support that outlasted any individual crisis. The boring logistics of frontier life were to find clean water, which merchants were honest, how to read the social dynamics of a new community, became opportunities for her to demonstrate that survival was easier when people looked out for each other. These sleepless conversations over coffee and shared meals were building something more durable than any individual success story. The conflicts that inevitably arose in communities where people from vastly different backgrounds were thrown together often found resolution through Martha Jane's particular combination of directness and humor. She had developed the skill of helping people find common ground without making anyone feel like they were losing face or compromising their principles. This wasn't formal mediation. It was the informal diplomacy that happens when someone with genuine respect for human nature helps others remember what they share rather than what divides them. The American frontier was creating new forms of community that required this kind of bridge building, and Martha Jane seemed naturally suited to the role. Her reputation for fairness and straight talk made her someone that different factions could trust to listen without judgment. The relationship she built with Native American individuals and communities demonstrated her ability to see past the fear and misunderstanding that characterized most cross-cultural interactions during this period. Martha Jane approached these relationships with the same respectful curiosity she brought to learning any new skill, understanding that different cultures had developed different solutions to common human problems. The stories that emerged from these interactions were dramatic confrontations or romantic adventures, but quiet examples of mutual recognition and respect between people who understood that the frontier belonged to all of them in different ways. These sleepless hours spent learning different perspectives on land, survival, and community were expanding her understanding of what it meant to be truly at home in the American West. Her gift for moving easily between the different social groups that populated frontier towns, soldiers, miners, business owners, traveling salesmen, farm families, spoke to an emotional intelligence that was becoming increasingly rare as these communities became more stratified. Martha Jane seemed to understand intuitively that everyone had something valuable to contribute, regardless of their background or current circumstances. The boring conversations about weather, crops, and family news that she maintained with people from all walks of life were actually investments in the social fabric that held these communities together. She could find something interesting in almost anyone because she approached new relationships with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined judgments. The way she treated children revealed another dimension of her character that would become part of the Calamity Jane legend, though usually in simplified form. Martha Jane had a natural affinity for young people who felt like outsiders or misfits, perhaps recognizing something of her own journey in their struggles to find their place in the world. She had a gift for taking children seriously without talking down to them, offering practical advice without being preachy, and demonstrating through her own example that there were many different ways to be successful and respected. The sleepless hours she spent listening to young people's concerns and offering gentle guidance were shaping the next generation of frontier citizens. These quiet mentoring relationships rarely made it into the dramatic stories, but they were perhaps her most lasting contribution to the communities where she lived. Her involvement in the less glamorous but essential work of community building, organizing barn raisings, coordinating assistance for families facing hardship, helping to establish informal schools and social gatherings, demonstrated that her leadership style was based on service rather than self-promotion. Martha Jane understood that sustainable communities required ongoing investment from people who were willing to do the boring, repetitive work of maintaining social connections and mutual support systems. The American frontier was teaching her that individual strength was most valuable when it was shared for collective benefit. These community-building activities never generated exciting stories, but they created the stable foundation that allowed more dramatic adventures to be possible. The informal networks of information and assistance that she helped maintain between scattered settlements became crucial infrastructure that supported the entire region's development. Martha Jane served as a node in these networks, someone who could be counted on to carry messages accurately, deliver supplies reliably, and provide honest assessments of conditions and opportunities in different areas. This role required the kind of trustworthiness that couldn't be faked or purchased. It had to be earned through consistent demonstration of character over time. The sleepless responsibility she felt for maintaining these connections showed her understanding that individual reputation was inseparable from community well-being. As her influence within these informal networks grew, Martha Jane was unknowingly becoming a bridge between the mythic American West of popular imagination and the practical realities of people trying to build meaningful lives in challenging circumstances. Her story was proving that heroism didn't require dramatic confrontations or individual glory. Sometimes the most important adventures happened in the quiet spaces between the legends, where real people did the daily work of caring for each other and building something lasting together. The bond she was forming with fellow travelers, neighbors, and friends would soon become the foundation for stories that would outlast any individual memory, transforming personal relationships into the kind of communal mythology that helps societies understand their own values and aspirations. The slow accumulation of years brought Martha Jane something more valuable than fame or fortune, the kind of deep understanding that comes only from having lived authentically through both triumph and hardship. As the 1890s unfolded across the American landscape, she found herself transitioning naturally from the role of adventurous newcomer to that of respected elder and storyteller. The sleepless nights of uncertainty that had once kept her planning routes and solving problems were now replaced by peaceful hours of reflection, where she could appreciate the journey that had brought her to this place of quiet influence. This wasn't the decline that society often expected from aging women, but a flowering of wisdom that came from having tested herself against real challenges and emerged with her integrity intact. Her story was evolving from one of individual adventure to something deeper, proof that a life lived with courage and authenticity creates its own form of lasting value. The young people who began seeking her out for guidance found in Martha Jane something rare in their rapidly changing world, someone who had navigated uncertainty with grace and could offer practical wisdom without preaching. These conversations often took place during the boring, routine activities that filled frontier life, mending equipment, preparing meals, organizing supplies, but they carried the weight of genuine mentorship. She had developed the ability to listen without judgment, to offer advice without insisting it be followed, and to share her own experiences as examples rather than rules. The American frontier was changing rapidly, and young women especially were looking for models of how to live with independence and purpose in a world that still offered them limited options. Martha Jane's example whispered possibilities that traditional society rarely acknowledged. Her approach to sharing stories during this period revealed a sophisticated understanding of how personal narrative could serve larger purposes. Rather than simply recounting adventures for entertainment, she began to craft her tales in ways that highlighted the values and insights she had gained through experience. The sleepless hours she spent refining these stories weren't about creating mythology for its own sake, but about finding ways to pass along wisdom in forms that would stick in people's memories. She understood intuitively that the most important lessons were often embedded in seemingly simple anecdotes about ordinary moments that had revealed extraordinary truths. These storytelling sessions never felt like lectures because she had mastered the art of teaching through example rather than instruction. The communities where she had lived and worked were beginning to recognize her contributions in ways that went beyond celebrity or novelty. Martha Jane was becoming the kind of person that others turned to when they needed someone with both practical experience and sound judgment. Her reputation for fairness and straight talk made her a natural mediator when conflicts arose, while her deep knowledge of regional geography and weather patterns made her advice invaluable for planning expeditions or settlements. The boring details of community organization, helping to establish supply routes, mediating disputes, advising on practical matters, were now being handled by someone whose opinion carried real weight. She had achieved something remarkable, respect based not on dramatic exploits, but on demonstrated character over time. During this period, Martha Jane began to understand her own life story as something larger than personal adventure. She saw it as proof that alternative paths were possible, that courage could be cultivated, and that individual choices could influence broader social change. This wasn't egotistical self-importance, but a mature recognition that her example had value for others who might be struggling with similar questions about identity, purpose, and possibility. The sleepless consideration she gave to this responsibility showed her understanding that influence comes with obligation. When young women asked her how she had found the courage to live so differently from social expectations, she offered not grand theories, but practical observations about the daily choices that add up to a meaningful life. Her involvement in various exhibitions and shows during this time served multiple purposes that went beyond simple entertainment or income generation. Martha Jane used these platforms to share stories that inspired others to think differently about their own possibilities, transforming what could have been mere spectacle into genuine education. She approached these appearances with the same authenticity that had characterized her entire journey, refusing to exaggerate or sensationalize her experiences for dramatic effect. The American public was hungry for stories that proved ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things, and she provided those stories while maintaining her commitment to truth over sensation. These performances never felt boring to audiences because they were witnessing something genuine, a real person sharing real wisdom gained through real experience. The way she balanced celebration of her own achievements with genuine humility about the role of circumstance and community support in her success demonstrated a kind of wisdom that comes only from deep self-reflection. Martha Jane had learned to see her life as part of a larger story about American possibility, while recognizing that her individual success had been made possible by the support and opportunities provided by others. This perspective allowed her to take pride in her accomplishments without claiming all the credit, and to acknowledge her limitations without diminishing her achievements. The sleepless hours she spent thinking about these complexities were shaping her into someone who could inspire others without intimidating them. Her relationship with the growing mythology around Calamity Jane became increasingly complex as she aged, requiring her to navigate the strange territory between being a real person and being a symbol. She seemed to understand intuitively that legends serve important functions in society, helping people imagine possibilities and understand values, even when they diverge from literal truth, rather than fighting the mythologizing process or becoming trapped by it. She found ways to guide it in directions that served her own values and the well-being of others. This wasn't manipulation, but a sophisticated understanding of how stories work in human culture. The boring negotiations between fact and fiction that this required were handled with the same practical intelligence she had brought to every other challenge in her life. The networks of friendship and respect that she had built over decades were now revealing their true value, providing her with the kind of security that comes from being genuinely valued by others. These relationships weren't based on her fame or her usefulness, but on the accumulated trust and affection that develops between people who have supported each other through various challenges over time. The American frontier had taught her that individual strength was most meaningful when it was shared for collective benefit, and now she was experiencing the return on those investments. These quiet connections provided more satisfaction than any public recognition could offer, because they were based on who she actually was rather than who people imagined her to be. As the 19th century drew to a close, Martha Jane was becoming a bridge between the mythic American West of popular imagination and the practical realities of people who had actually lived through that transformation. Her story was proving that heroism didn't require perfect circumstances or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes the most important adventures happened in the quiet spaces where real people made daily choices about courage, integrity, and service to others. The wisdom she had gained through experience was preparing her to leave behind something more valuable than gold or fame, a living example of how to age with grace while remaining true to the values that had guided her entire remarkable journey, and how authentic character could create ripples of influence that would extend far beyond any individual lifetime. The gentle whisper of history carries certain stories forward not because they were the loudest or most dramatic, but because they touched something essential about human possibility that each generation needs to rediscover for itself. As the 20th century dawned across America, Martha Jane Canary's influence was beginning to ripple outward in ways that she herself might never have fully anticipated. The sleepless hours that young women spent wondering about their own potential were now informed by the knowledge that someone like them had chosen authenticity over approval, courage over comfort, and had not only survived, but thrived. This wasn't the kind of celebrity influence that burns bright and fades quickly. This was the deeper impact that comes from having lived a life that expands other people's sense of what's possible. Her story was becoming proof that individual choices could indeed change the world, one inspired person at a time. The conversations that took place in parlors and around kitchen tables across the country began to include references to that woman out west who had shown that conventional limitations were often just suggestions rather than immutable laws. These discussions weren't always admiring. Some found her choices threatening or inappropriate, but they were happening, and that itself represented a kind of progress. The American imagination was slowly expanding to include new models of female possibility, and Martha Jane's example was part of that gradual transformation. The boring, everyday conversations about what women could and should do were being influenced by the knowledge that someone had already done much more than anyone thought possible. These sleepless debates about propriety and possibility were reshaping social expectations in ways that would benefit countless women who would never know her name. In the growing cities of the East and Midwest, young women working in factories, offices, and shops found themselves drawing strength from stories about someone who had proved that a woman could be independent, competent, and respected without sacrificing her essential humanity. The daily grind of industrial work wasn't the same as frontier survival, but the underlying questions about autonomy, dignity, and self-determination were remarkably similar. Martha Jane's example whispered that it was possible to maintain your integrity while adapting to circumstances, to be strong without being hard, to command respect without demanding it. The sleepless shifts in textile mills and the long hours in department stores became more bearable when you knew that someone had faced even greater challenges with grace and determination. The communities where Martha Jane had lived and worked were developing their own traditions around her memory, creating informal networks of storytelling that preserved not just the dramatic incidents, but the quieter lessons about character and community. These weren't official monuments or formal recognition, but the more powerful legacy of people whose lives had been touched by her example, continuing to pass along the values she had embodied. The American frontier was becoming history, but the principles she had demonstrated, authenticity, courage, service to others, remain relevant in any context. These sleepless conversations between mothers and daughters, mentors and students, friends and neighbors were creating a kind of cultural transmission that no official biography could match. The emergence of the women's suffrage movement found unexpected support in the stories that circulated about frontier women who had already been demonstrating female competence and leadership for decades. Martha Jane's example, along with those of other pioneer women, provided concrete evidence that women could handle responsibility, make sound decisions, and contribute meaningfully to society when given the opportunity. The boring work of organizing rallies, circulating petitions, and building political coalitions was sustained partly by the knowledge that women had already proved their capabilities in even more challenging circumstances. Her story became part of the larger narrative about American women's readiness for full citizenship and equal participation in democracy. The writers and journalists who began documenting the closing of the frontier understood that they were capturing something that was disappearing forever, a particular kind of American possibility that had existed when the continent still held vast spaces for reinvention. Martha Jane's life became part of this documentation, but in ways that often emphasized her symbolic importance over her individual humanity. The sleepless work of separating fact from fiction in these accounts revealed the complex relationship between historical truth and cultural need. Her real story was inspiring enough without embellishment, but the process of turning a person into a symbol inevitably involved some loss of nuance and complexity. The educational opportunities that were slowly opening up for young women in the early 1900s carried with them the implicit message that female potential had been consistently underestimated throughout history. Martha Jane's example served as evidence that women had always been capable of more than society allowed, and that expanding opportunities would simply make visible capabilities that had always existed. The boring curriculum of domestic science and teacher training was gradually being supplemented with discussions about broader possibilities for female achievement. These sleepless hours of study and preparation were informed by the knowledge that previous generations of women had already broken many barriers, making future progress seem inevitable rather than impossible. The gradual transformation of the American West from frontier territory to settled region preserved Martha Jane's story as part of the founding mythology of entire states and communities. Tourist attractions, local histories, and regional celebrations began to include references to her as someone who had helped establish the character and values that residents wanted to maintain. This wasn't always historically accurate, but it served the important function of connecting present communities with ideals of courage, independence, and authenticity that they wanted to preserve. The American tradition of reinventing the past to serve present needs found in her story exactly the kind of inspiring example that could unite people around shared values. The entertainment industry's growing fascination with Western themes ensured that simplified versions of Martha Jane's story would reach audiences far beyond those who had any direct connection to frontier history. While these popular representations often sacrificed complexity for drama, they also introduced her example to millions of people who might never have encountered it otherwise. The sleepless work of screenwriters, novelists, and performers gradually embedded her story into American popular culture in ways that would influence how future generations thought about female possibility. Even when the details were wrong, the underlying message that women could be strong, independent, and heroic reached audiences who needed to hear it. As the decades passed, Martha Jane Canary's legacy revealed itself to be less about any specific achievement and more about the demonstration that a single person, living with courage and authenticity, could expand the realm of what everyone believes is possible. Her gift to future generations wasn't a blueprint to follow, but proof that blueprints could be rewritten. The boring, daily choices she had made about how to live, how to treat others, and how to respond to challenges had accumulated into something powerful. Evidence that ordinary people could create extraordinary change simply by refusing to accept limitations as permanent truths. The sleepless dreams of countless women who came after her were informed by the knowledge that someone had already walked through doors that others claimed didn't exist, leaving them open for everyone who had the courage to follow. And so, we reach the gentle end of Martha Jane's remarkable journey, where the dust has settled on countless trails and the echoes of her choices continue to whisper across time. In our world of instant everything, instant messages, instant gratification, instant fame, there's something deeply soothing about a story that unfolded slowly, deliberately, with the patient rhythm of someone who understood that meaningful change happens one authentic choice at a time. The sleepless nights that once kept Martha Jane planning her next adventure have given way to peaceful rest, but the dreams she made possible continue to inspire anyone who has ever wondered whether they have the courage to write their own story. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your modern life with its expanded opportunities and hard-won freedoms, take a moment to appreciate the debt we owe two pioneers like Martha Jane Canary. She lived during a time when choosing an unconventional path required extraordinary bravery, yet she faced that challenge with grace, humor, and unwavering authenticity. Her story reminds us that the freedoms we take for granted today were made possible by individuals who were willing to live differently, to prove that alternative paths were viable, and to demonstrate that courage and character matter more than convention. The American spirit of possibility that we still celebrate was shaped by people like her, who refused to accept that impossible was a final answer. The frontier be tamed now, mapped and settled and connected by highways and internet cables, but the frontier of human potential remains as vast and promising as Martha Jane found it all those years ago. Each of us still has the opportunity to explore territories of possibility that previous generations could barely imagine. When we face our own moments of choice between safety and authenticity, between approval and integrity, between limitation and possibility, we can draw strength from her example. She showed us that living true to yourself, unselfish, it's one of the greatest gifts you can give to the world because it expands what everyone believes is possible. Perhaps the most beautiful part of Martha Jane's legacy is how it continues to open doors for anyone who needs proof that they can become who they're meant to be. In our sleepless modern nights, when anxiety about the future or regret about the past keeps our minds spinning, her story offers the gentle reminder that authenticity is always an option, that courage can be cultivated one small choice at a time, and that the most meaningful adventures often happen in the quiet spaces where we simply decide to be ourselves. The boring, daily decisions about how to treat others, how to respond to challenges, and how to live our values still accumulate into something powerful, a life that matters, regardless of whether anyone else is paying attention. So as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift towards sleep, carry with you the peaceful knowledge that you, too, have the power to leave the world a little more open, a little more possible than you found it. Martha Jane's greatest achievement wasn't becoming famous or breaking barriers or even surviving in a challenging environment. It was demonstrating that a single person, living with courage and authenticity, can expand the realm of what everyone believes is possible. That frontier is still out there, waiting for those brave enough to explore it. What kind of stories help you sleep best? What decade or theme would you love to hear about in our next sleepless journey together? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Be your suggestion will become our next peaceful adventure into the past. If you found comfort in tonight's gentle story, consider subscribing to American Sleepless Story and turning on notifications, so you can continue this soothing journey through the forgotten corners of history where ordinary people did extraordinary things, simply by being themselves. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. May your sleep be as peaceful as a prairie night under endless stars, and may you wake knowing that your own story of courage is still being written, one authentic choice at a time. Until our next sleepless story together, rest well in the knowledge that the best adventures are often the ones that unfold slowly, quietly, in the beautiful spaces where nothing dramatic happens but everything meaningful does.